Good afternoon, guys. It's nice to be with you again, looking at a story from the Bible. And today's one is a fascinating story and also quite complex. It's also full of twists and turns. It's a story found in the Bible, in the Old Testament or the Hebrew Scriptures, in chapter 16 of the first book of the Bible, known as Genesis. And it tells the story of a woman named Hagar, who gave birth to a son who was named Ishmael. Now, Hagar wasn't a free person. She was the slave girl of a woman named Sarai, who later became Sarah, and Sarah was married to a man named Abram, who later became Abraham with an H. We're told that Sarah was fairly old, and we're also told that she was barren. And this is an old term used to let us know that she couldn't have any children. And so she hatched a plan. She gave her husband permission to sleep with her slave girl Hagar in the hope that Hagar might fall pregnant. And this might sound a little crazy to us, but I did some reading and I found out that it wasn't that uncommon in those days. It happened quite a lot. Hagar fell pregnant, and apparently the tension between the two women began to rise. Hagar now saw herself not as a slave, but as an equal to Sarah. And so Sarah went to Abram to complain, and she began to treat Hagar very badly. And so Hagar ran away. She went off into the desert, but she met a heavenly messenger there who told her that she should go back to Abram and Sarah. Hagar listened to the messenger, and the child is born. And according to the messenger, he would be a wild ass of a man. In other words, he'd be a free spirit, and he wouldn't take nonsense from anyone. He would be quite rough and tough. Furthermore, she was to give the child the name Ishmael. And then, surprise, surprise, Sarah, in her old age, fell pregnant also, and she gave birth to a son, and they named him Isaac. Isaac wasn't rough and tough like Ishmael, and one day when he was a teenager, when Ishmael was a teenager and Isaac was a small boy, Sarah witnessed Ishmael mocking her son. And seeing this, and also fearing that Ishmael would share Isaac's inheritance, Sarah told Abraham that he had to send Hagar away with her son. Hagar went out into the desert with some food and water given to her by Abraham, but when she ran out of supplies and didn't know where to turn, and with a young child who was crying, she cried out to God. And we are told that God heard her cries, or the cries of Ishmael rather, and he had compassion on her and her son. The angel provided water for Hagar and Ishmael after opening her eyes, and God promised Hagar that her son Ishmael would make a great nation. Hagar, being a caring and possibly overbearing mum, found her son a wife from Egypt, and they settled in the desert of Paran, and Ishmael became an archer, we are told. Ishmael eventually had 12 sons, who each became tribal chiefs in regions all the way from Assyria to Egypt. He also had one known daughter, Mahalath or Basimath, who was the third wife of another biblical figure called Esau. Ishmael appeared at the burial of his father Abraham, and he died at the ripe old age of 137. And so we ask the question, what do we learn from this story? What does the story teach us? Well, in one sense, it reminds us of the story of the Israelites when they were slaves in Egypt. We're told that just as God had compassion on Hagar because he heard Ishmael's cries, so he had compassion on the Israelites in Egypt because of their cries. Crying out to God, God heard their cries. When they were all in desperate need, God appeared to them and they received God's compassion. And I think this tells us something very important, that far too often when we've tried everything else and everything else has failed and fallen apart, as a last resort, we turn to God. We cry out to God for help instead of knowing that God is always with us every day and that God never lets us go. Where do we see this in the story? In the fact that when Hagar's eyes were open, she saw a well and was able to help herself and her child. Whereas before there was helplessness and blind panic, when her eyes were opened and she turned to God and realized that God was with her all the time, she saw clearly and her panic disappeared and her fear went away and she trusted God. Now, to have one's eyes opened is a fairly common theme in the Bible. We sometimes read that when Jesus healed blind people, their eyes were opened and then they followed him. This didn't mean simply having their eyes open in a physical way, but in a spiritual way also. When people truly encountered God, encountered Jesus and trusted in God and trusted in Jesus, then they were given eyes to see, and they saw the world and its people through different eyes. God does the same for us when we trust in God. When we realize and understand that God is always with us, God never lets us go, that God is as close to us as the air we breathe, even if we don't realize it. And that even in the midst of terrible trouble, God will show us a way out because God is faithful and God never lets us go. Put very simply, when life hands you lemons, as they say, God will show you how to make lemonade. Thank you very much for listening to me. I hope you have a lovely day. Bye.